put themselves in a deficit down to 1,000 calories, but they only ate carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So insulin was spiked. Obviously, they would lose weight, but would they just retain fat mass and lose muscle mass?
Yeah. What a great question. So they would lose weight, but it would be relatively more lean mass than fat mass as a percent. Now, what you've done here is actually allow me to touch on a really important point, which is a lot of people will cite these low carb versus low fat studies. And they'll say, well, look at the degree of fat loss. It's always pretty close. Although, mind you, there has literally never been one single paper published finding that the low fat diet caused more statistically significant weight loss. Not one. Yeah. But there are several that show the low carb diet having a significantly greater effect, but never one in the other direction. But even still, they will say, look at both of these studies, both of them lost weight, or both groups, low carb versus low fat. Yeah, but they're always low calorie. That's the thing that people don't appreciate, is that you've taken someone eating a standard American diet, high fat, high carb, relatively high calorie. Even when you put them in the low fat group, you've cut their calories down. So they're eating less of everything now, even less glucose. And so it's not surprising that their insulin is also reduced. And so you always have this huge confounding variable. So just to finish that thought, and then I'll come back to the issue you brought up, the actual only way to truly declare a winner, whether low carb is better or low fat is better, is you have to see which one is more resistant to fat gain. So rather than doing these hypocaloric studies, what we have to do, and it's never been done ever, do a hypercaloric version of both diets. So you take a ketogenic, low carb, but matched with calories to a high carb, but they're both high calorie. And now let's see who gets fat less, if that makes sense. Now we can actually start to tease apart the difference between the insulin theory of obesity or the caloric theory of obesity. But if we take the average person and they're only eating glucose at 1,000 grams, 1,000 calories, they're probably still eating less overall than they clearly were than when they're eating. Yeah, so if they have let's just say they were eating 2,000 calories and they were weight stable. Yeah, insulin would still come down in that individual, and they may have an underlying a little bit of some bits of hyperglycemia, but I've not seen a study that's done this. I suspect if you compared that person to the person eating 1,000 calories of pure fat, the person eating the pure fat, let's say they both lose 10 pounds, but I bet as a percent of body fat, the fat eater is lost more fat because fat does not increase insulin at all. Anyone who says otherwise is looking at type 1 diabetes studies, and that's a very different metabolic milieu because of the underlying hyperglucagonemia, which changes the metrics a bit. But if you take a non-diabetic and they eat pure fat, there's no insulin spike whatsoever. This has been published for decades. I'm about to publish my own report looking at this exact same thing. So fat alone elicits no insulin spike, so that guy's going to have a higher metabolic rate. And because the insulin is low, he's going to be burning fat like gangbusters. The other guy who's eating 1,000 calories of glucose, he's still going to lose weight, of course, but I suspect that as a percent, he's losing a little more lean mass and preserving a little bit of fat mass. Just as a reminder, my kind of three pillars are control carbs, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. And with control carbs, it is first for a reason because I consider it the most important. You, as much as possible, you'd want those 100 grams of carbs to not be coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. You'd want them to be whole fruits and vegetables. And the difference with the whole fruit and vegetable as opposed to the processed starches and sugars is the presence of fiber. So focus on fiber. If you're eating digestible carbohydrate, very likely nature has a fiber that's coming with it. And that's by design, and that's how we should take it. But still, if it's the 100 grams, I would say you want to get that not for supper, not for the last meal of the day, because you do not want to go to bed hyperglycemic. Hyperglycemia stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm convinced one of the main reasons most people sleep so poorly these days, and I'm sympathetic to that, I'm inherently a bad sleeper, a lot of it is because they spike their glucose before they go to bed, because that's when most people indulge in starchy and sugary snacks. And then they have activated their sympathetic nervous system, so their body temperature climbs and their heart rate goes up and it's beating harder. And so they're lying in bed wondering why they can't fall asleep and wondering what they're anxious about. They're not anxious about anything. You just are hyperglycemic, and that activated your sympathetic nervous system, this fight or flight response. So my advice always is load up lunch. Let lunch be the biggest meal, especially if a person is not inclined to have breakfast. Even though if you are a breakfast eater and that's when you find you're the hungriest, then you could load up those carbs for breakfast then. But I want to be a healthy grandpa, of course. That's very much an interest for me. And I'm worried about some chronic diseases. And so I'm unapologetically an advocate of ketones, at least for some time of the day. If a person can have some brief period of ketones, that is going to be so helpful for brain health. And of all the diseases that scare me, Alzheimer's is probably the one that scares me the most.
Ditto.
Study after study has shown that the brain loves ketones. I want to give my brain a break from relying on glucose and allow it to consume ketones, which it does incredibly readily. This is, as a brief tangent, this is one of the things I disabuse my students of so often. They've been taught that the brain prefers glucose. That is absolutely false. Even if you have a body that has, say, 5 millimolar glucose and only 2 millimolar ketones, which is very achievable with a fast, the brain is already getting about 70% of its energy from those ketones. So even when the ketones are at half the level of the glucose, the ketones are already providing 2 to 3 times more energy to the brain than the glucose is. So the brain loves ketones. I want to give my brain some ketones, and to do that, I fast through breakfast almost all the time.